So we have now enough time for a common discussion. I already see several people who would like to intervene. So I will start from you. Please, can you have a micro? Thanks a lot. Then I go to you, I think, yeah.
Sari Hanafi, Vice President of International Sociological Association from American University of Beirut. To Professor Dambra, I fully agree with you in your analysis on using post-coloniality that Europe should recognize its past to understand the present. But I found the way that how you use the post-coloniality as a lens to understand the refugee crisis in Europe now is weak. So my question to you, where are the limitations of this approach in sociology? We are not in history, we are in sociology. So why I am saying that? Because I come from the Arab region where usually the anti-democratic and illiberal left who chant more post-coloniality. And it's a way to curtail the claim of that there is something new, the dictatorship in the region is nothing to do. It's mainly a new dynamic. It's not a post-colonial dynamic. It's something else. I mean, Algeria. If you go to Algeria, you see how the pro-regime sociologists use the post-coloniality to curtail any criticism come from France to the violation of human rights. In Syria, the same thing. Hezbollah who chant so I feel that there is a use and misuse of this concept. What is your take?
Thank you. Then I've seen you. Can you get a microphone, please? Gentlemen.
My name is Wei Wu from Shanghai. I studied in Ireland, in Cork, for 4 years, so it's really a privilege to be here and listen to this two wonderful presentation. So the issue I want to raise, I think really connect the two presentations is that migrants, child generations, like second and third generation of migrants, they are facing the possibility of downward mobility, which is contrary to their parents' primary motivation of migrating. So the question really is, as sociologists, what kind of suggestions we can contribute to a kind of policy in the future to promote or secure these youth and children for their social benefits and well-beings. And thank you very much again.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think what I would say is that my focus really is on Europe in this context. That when post-colonial theory emerges, it emerges largely focused either on South Asia or the Middle East, and then you had the emergence of decoloniality, which focuses on the relationships between Europe and Latin America. And one of the things that seems to get missed out in this is that Europe somehow absents itself from having to think about its colonial past or its post-colonial present. So in terms of using post-colonial theory or post-colonial perspectives, what I want to do is to shake up the way in which we within Europe think of Europe as somehow outside of these processes. So we recognize that colonialism is something that happens elsewhere. Habermas talks about post-colonial immigrant societies. So the only thing that's post-colonial are those migrants who come to Europe. There's no way within his framework of understanding Europe itself as post-colonial because it can't understand itself as colonial. So in terms of thinking through a proper historical sociology, that is a sociology that uses an adequate history, it would have to be a colonial history that underpins the ways in which we understand the contemporary European present. And then in terms of the problems you identify elsewhere, they would have to be worked out, and those aren't areas that I work on, so I couldn't comment. Thank you.
I'm not a migration specialist, but I have to say,
Can you kindly
sorry, I'm not a migration specialist, but as an outsider to the UK, I must say I was enormously struck in the recent election by the gap between reality and the rhetoric. And Lucinda Platt gave an outstanding presentation on migration to the UK. And it seems quite extraordinary that in the UK that anybody could think that the solution to migration is to exit the EU when there are as many British citizens in the EU as vice versa, and when obviously in terms of skill levels and demographics they require. The Irish case I think is slightly different. In Ireland, you do see common features that you see in other countries, such as migrant penalties and arguments about how these are connected. Are they connected to language? Are they connected to, being able to translate your qualifications you brought with you and so on? But gratefully, given that Ireland has been the most awful place to live in the past in terms of control of Catholic Church and so on, the one thing we haven't seen is any political party which has sought to mobilise around anti-migration issues. And I think there is a dominant view that migrants do indeed contribute, generally and economically, to the society. That might change, and I'm not saying that we are without sin, but overall, for a country that had hardly any inward migration for a long period of time, other than from the UK, the experience, I think, has been, rather better than we would hoped. Maybe that has something to do with the fact that we are a migrant nation. It would be somewhat hypocritical to, take these sort of attitudes to migrants when we have both in the past and in the present sent our children all over the globe. And let's hope that continues, okay?
Thanks a lot. Please.
No, 2 points. I agree on your history, colonization, republicanism, and so on, and how the European project was the reverse of the colonial diffusion. But he has to explain in terms of balance of money, where is the economic resource, economic production. A point in history, with independence, 58-62, French sociologists, politicians create an association in Tunis, 58, which is called Association Internationale des Sociologues de Langue Française. Not only the French, but it could be Tunisian, Italian, Belgium, Switzerland. You go on meeting, we have meeting in Istanbul 2011, before the event, but 500 meters from Gezi Place. We have meeting in Rabat 3 years ago. You could conceive this association as post-colonial, because we came from the West with the academic system. We want to attract students within the economy of knowledge. But we consider the system, we consider the scholar how to enhance their own social imagination. So, for the trouble, en français on dit le trouble de l'homme blanc, quoi. The trouble of the post-colonial people, we tried to repair. But as it was quote, facing the wave of refugees, we needed a response, politic of present. Concretely, if you go to migration study, in France, there's expert to welcome the white colonial from Algeria. We have to build 1 million housing in 62. It's a voluntary politic. It also protects to reinforce presidential power, much more authoritarian upon parliamentary. So it could establish a lot of things. So if you go to politics, European economy is attractive, whatever the labor market is extensive. If you accept this wave, it will enrich the service class. You have to say that in a colonial and post-colonial perspective. If you accept this wave, today it's about 200,000 people, it could rising up. We need more building, we need more welfare, school, education. If you accept this wave, we accept the status of migrant and service class. So it's also a paradox in terms of sociology, and this requires more enlightenment. But if you go to the cause as social scientists, you may know by immigration survey, that the destabilization of the state will create the migrant waves. If I take example, when Portugal was authoritarian, there were a lot of migrant Portuguese. When Portugal became to be democratic, a lot of family come back. Today, with the economic crisis, the migration wave. So it depends, it's a mix of this story between economic and state. So the response, if the wave is rising up, has to be economic, welfare, and also citizenship. But even if we do that, we accept the subaltern position of this migrant. They are put by the situation in subaltern position. The idea of co-development is there, but it's not working very well. The key point is the stabilization of state and democracy. And if I want to go to a concrete question, but what could be the status of the wave of migrants there? Would be service class with low page contract? Or do we enhance as a European response to keep the welfare, whatever the argument, competitiveness, and to keep the full right for those people coming in? Yeah.
There was another person. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was very complex, so maybe it would be better if... Oh, okay, anyway. Okay, I had a comment, and I think it would be quite nice if both the speakers could comment on my comment. And this comment is mainly on the first presentation in the light of the second one. I perfectly understand why you concentrate on Ireland, Iceland and Greece as 3 case studies which somehow show something interesting about the topic. But what I don't really understand is the reason behind choosing the original initial data set being based on the old European Union countries. What I want to say is that we're in Prague, and this is a meeting of European Sociological Association into which lots of people from diverse countries from Europe, from within European Union and outside European Union come. And then I don't really understand why some of these countries are not represented in the data sets, even though they are part of, for example, European Union SILK surveys. So when I was listening to both the presentation, it made me think maybe there is some kind of not only outward-oriented colonialism of European Union and Europe, also maybe some inward colonialism, which is not only about the countries outside, but also about the countries and people inside. That would be quite nice if you could comment on that.
Start.
Okay. Well, first to, I don't really want to start defending myself, but to defend myself, if you look at my CV, you will, sorry, if you look at my CV, you will see that between, the year 2000 and now, I have probably published about 25 papers using EU SILK, and that in 20 of those I have included the Eastern European countries, okay? So it's the, I mean, why wouldn't one? For most purposes and for most problematics, adding the Eastern European countries, adds really interesting aspects. The decision in this case was because our focus was on a very particular debate relating to polarization and middle-class squeeze. And this, it seemed to us, had occurred and been debated and was most relevant, within the sort of set of countries I looked at. So it's certainly not part of my routine, to exclude, Eastern European countries. The focus on, Iceland. Also, the second part is probably my own limitations. Okay, in that, but because beyond that, because when we focused in on Iceland, Ireland, and Greece, okay. It was not a decision taken in advance, although it turned out the results weren't astonishing, but it was because of the particular experiences they'd had, okay? Now, in Eastern Europe, I imagine Estonia would be the country that would, jump out there. But it seemed to me that the processes, underlying the nature of the crisis in Estonia and so on, are probably so different from those in the countries we were looking at, that again, it would take us beyond our capacity to deal with it. So it would be very interesting to see if somebody did look at at Estonia. But as I say, what we're particularly interested in was in these extreme cases, okay, what were the consequences in terms of inequality? Because substantively what I'm really interested in, and of course this comes from my Irish experience, I think there's a tendency to formulate these questions of the impact of the recession in terms of an old-fashioned rhetoric of polarization and inequality, okay? Which is then incapable of dealing with the political realities in those countries. So for instance, in Ireland, the political system has been completely shaken up, but not by any degree of left-right-wing differentiation, but by a serious disillusionment with politics, which can only be understood by extending your concerns to what happened to the middle classes. So that was our focus. Thank you.
I think the impetus of my work is really to think about the ways in which contemporary sociological concepts and categories are constructed. And the argument that I wish to make is that the history that we recognize or that we don't recognize has an implication on the ways in which we construct those concepts and categories. So in terms of thinking about the place of migrants within Europe or Europe's relationship to its others and so on, one of the questions is really to think about, well, for example, when we talk about poverty, and we talk about poverty on a global scale, we often naturalize poverty in other places. So to use a sort of stereotypical phrase, there is poverty in the third world, or if we're talking about Africa, Africa is poor. I mean, this is the basis on which all these politicians are scaremongering around African migrants coming to Europe. And what I wish to point to is that if the poverty in Africa, or that the poverty in Africa is created by the very same processes that create wealth within Europe. So there is no way in which our welfare states, our wealth, our social infrastructure, our resources within Europe exist separate from the entanglements of the creation of poverty elsewhere. If we accept that fact, then we would need to think about the ways in which we address poverty, i.e., it wouldn't be in terms of charity or benevolence or development or aid. We might begin to think about it in terms of what would be socially just, what would be the correct form of reparation that might need to be made in order to address what is a continuing contemporary injustice. And how would we address that? And so that may well take sacrifices from us. But it would be sacrifices from us that recognize that our privileges are based precisely on the creation of conditions that have people banging on the door wanting to be let in. Related to that, and in terms of the other question that was asked, I mean, one of the things often when I make this argument, one of the things that people sometimes say to me is, oh, well, you're talking about Europe generally, but Europe internally is very diverse. Or if I'm talking about the EU, then there are new members of the European Union which don't have the colonial history that places like Britain, Germany, France, etc. have. So why should they have to be responsible for the sorts of claims that I'm making in relation to these former colonial powers? And I would say that if any country wishes to be part of Europe or the European Union, because it believes itself also to be part of the European Enlightenment or sharing common European values, or thinks that somehow it's required or necessary to be part of the EU as a member state, then it also has to take on board the responsibilities that membership entails. So you can't have European Enlightenment without also having responsibility for the European slave trade. You can't have access to the European Union and access to the resources that are made available through the European Union, through its colonial history, without also then taking responsibility for migrants and refugees who come to Europe.
Please, another question.
I have a short question for you. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but I really have a problem when we call this present crisis migrant crisis. I think, and this is omnipresent in media in Europe, And we started one debate on Al Jazeera Balkans and insisted that we call this crisis refugee crisis, because these people are running to save their lives, not in pursuit of some happiness. As a child, I was a refugee for 4 years during the war in ex-Yugoslavia, so this is not a situation that you choose. You just have to go in order to save your life, in order not to be killed. So I think that it is very important, especially in media and intellectual debate, that we call this present crisis now that we had with people from Syria running and so on, a refugee, or as Professor Baumann at the beginning said, he said refugee and displaced persons. So this is, I'm just wondering for your opinion. Thank you.
I mean, just to say, I completely agree with you. I mean, I think the Al Jazeera article was an incredibly important intervention, and because one of the things that's happening, particularly in the UK context, is that there had been a lot of discourse around migrants, hostile discourse, and then this gets enveloped within the same sort of process, and there's a need to make a distinction and say that people who come claiming refugee status on the basis of war, violence and persecution, they have rights. They have rights under our international treaty obligations. All European countries have signed up to the UNHCR. We're part of the Geneva Convention through being within the European Union. The individuals who arrive are refugees. So I completely accept that point. I want to, in terms of the intellectual argument, I want to make a broader point that encompasses both the current refugee crisis and then the arguments around migrants and citizens and so on. But thanks for that clarification.
Thank you. I was wondering to which extent we should insist it's a post-colonial condition, because the coloniality of Europe still continues in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, the sales of weapons to all the dictatorships around the world. So your presentation gives an impression of as if this was the question of the past, when it's already a question of the present and probably the future. Yeah, thank you.
Perhaps we give the micro.
I've got a question for Chris in relation to class. Much of the debate about the squeezed middle relates to social classes, and you've chosen to use income classes. And you almost wanted this question to be asked, maybe. You alluded to that at the earlier part of your presentation. And I'm wondering if that makes quite a strong impact on the analysis because of what you're looking at. You're looking at attitudes as well as some concrete experiences in relation to stress, income stress. Is that more likely to be more strongly correlated with income classes as opposed to social classes?
Yeah, it's a perfectly reasonable question, and you say even during my presentation I pretty well invited it. I have done this analysis on Irish data, where I've done it for both income classes and social classes, and it's been published in the Journal of European Social Policy and Social Indicators Research. When I looked at the EU data, and I will go back to it to see what I can do, but it was rather problematic. Just at the point where you need quality data in relation to, because clearly self-employment in social classes, self-employment and the nature of the self-employment and how many employees and all these things become very important in terms of, particularly if you want to compare it across a very large number of countries, okay? And I found there were serious issues with the data, which would have made things, pretty hard to sustain clear arguments on it. I will go back to it, but I'm not wonderfully optimistic on that, as I say, because what's tended to happen is that you can use social classes within the EU Silk, but then you do it at a level of aggregation, which takes away some of the really vital distinctions. Because I think you're absolutely right. Again, I hate to go back to the case of Ireland, but it's obviously the one I know best. What happened in Ireland was that with the boom in the construction sector, large number of people became self-employed, some with employees, some without. And they were the ones who were absolutely smashed. And so, of course, this would give you something in addition, in addition to income classes. But I pursued it with income classes, one, because, economists have been pursuing these issues, and like social mobility is an example, where an area where, strong sociological tradition, and sociologists come in and almost take it over. And they've been doing similar thing with the sort of income class stuff. And as I said previously, one of the things I was particularly concerned about, and it's not just Ireland, it's in Greece as well, is that I don't think you can understand the nature of the response to the crisis across a broad stratum of people and the political implications that's had simply by coming with standard notions of inequality and inequality getting worse. It's a good deal more differentiated than that. And I think subjective experience is a very strong part of it. So I did it because it was the best I could do for the moment. But I will come back to the issue of social class and hope to do something better. And it's a perfectly valid question you raised.
Thank you. To use the term post-colonial, so when I talk about post-colonial Europe, I wish to argue for a Europe that understands itself in terms of the colonial, and to understand itself in terms of historical colonialism, but that doesn't disavow its continuing coloniality. So to talk about post-colonial Europe is to talk about a Europe that understands itself as constituted by its colonial past, and then to use that understanding to think about its continuing involvement within colonial projects in the present. So the post-colonial for me is really a perspective with which to try and open up some of these issues, because it's been incredibly hard to intervene within the debates of how we understand our history in Europe and how we could change that.
I want to comment on the refugee topic. I just want to throw in the fact that the refugee crisis got really bad only after the Cold War ended in the last 25 years. It wasn't so bad before because people didn't have so many reasons to flee. There have not been so many or so bad civil wars in Africa and the Middle East. And I fully agree with you with the point that these people are fleeing because Africa and other parts of the world are in a globalized system which sustains our high level of material consumption. But then I'm really asking myself, when I'm looking for critical academic science, there's only one discipline left today which systematically explores these mechanisms. That's geography. Geography is the only discipline that still does a systematic analysis of capitalism. And that's a critic, I'm a sociologist, that's a critic for sociology today. Sociology is a science and most presentations I've heard these 3 days here, not all, but most, fully ignore the fact that we do live in a capitalist society. And I think it's not very courageous not to mention that, not even to mention the word capitalism, because it makes no sense trying to understand these things without referring to profit maximization, to all these mechanisms. And I think we all know, if Europe wouldn't exploit African countries, uranium for nuclear power plants, food production that's exported, fish fished away off the coast of Somalia, and so on. If that wouldn't happen, this capitalist system couldn't work. So we can't have a good capitalism. I mean, I think we all agree on that. And it's not enough just to mention here or there or leave it to PhD students in first semesters to say, oh, it's bad, we know it. No, there should be systematic analysis of that. And that existed. The Frankfurt School did it, other people did it. But in the last 25 years, sociology became incredibly tame, and that's bad. And it should be better.
So yours will be the last question or comment, because we are going to close.
Thank you very much. At first, I really want to agree that it is very important that Europe will reflect more on historical matters. And we as sociologists, we have to try to cope with that. But I feel that the presentation, which really concentrated only on one issue, really is opening the Pandora box, which is very difficult to cope with, because from eastern side of Europe, European Union, we then should like also to discuss the problems connected with Yalta, to discuss the problem connected with other historical, say, grievances. And by my mind, it is very important that really we learn to cope with historical grievances, but without this a bit too straightforward, say, implications, because really, listening to you, we, from other side of Europe, maybe start to think, but then why we have to pay for British or French debts? Who will pay for those debts which were created in Munich? Who were created for those debts who were created in Yalta and so on? So I just want to warn that here is very difficult, very complicated problems. We have to deal with those. We have to include historical reflection. But we cannot make this kind of quite, say, straightforward bridges from this historic reflection to political solutions. We have to, as sociologists, understand and imagine very broad context of all those things. Thank you.
I leave my colleague to deal with this question broadly, but maybe something we might remember is that some of the historic injustices are very recent. The treatment of Ireland, Greece, and even more so Cyprus by the European Union in recent years has been completely and absolutely disgraceful. And I've listened to people at this conference, talk about, European agendas and European solidarity and so on. I have to say that anybody coming from any one of those countries and watching how they have been treated, in the future will seek to first defend their own sectional interest. Because at the time when solidarity was most required, it has been entirely and completely lacking. And not only has solidarity been absent, but the understanding of these problems being imposed from Northern Europe, and particularly from, from Germany, doesn't even have any coherent sense. It is a form of economics which is not recognizable, in any of the macroeconomic textbooks, and yet we have it imposed on us. So, as I say, there are very recent historical grievances which are going to make problems of creating European solidarity more and more difficult in the future.
Thanks, Chris.
At the outset of the talk, I did suggest that the colonial entanglements across Europe would be different, and that this would be something that would need to be worked out in a more systematic manner. I would also suggest, and I would point to this again, that to the extent that I've talked about the European colonial project, all countries that seek to be a part of the European Union take up the history of the European Union as well as its present. And so whilst there will be many different sorts of processes that need to be worked out, the key question for me is that Europe as a project is constituted as a colonial project. And this is something on which we've had no discussion. Per Hansen and Stephen Jonsson's book, Eurafrica, is one of the first systematic considerations of this. Garavini has also talked about it a little bit, and there's been some murmurings around it. But the idea that the EU is a colonial project, how would that change the ways in which we understand Europe and European values? And that's an open question, and that doesn't exclude the possibility for also thinking about the more complicated histories within Europe. But I wanted to flag up here the one thing that I think has been systematically neglected from histories of the EU and considerations of Europe more generally.